Hey everyone, hope you're well. Today we are talking about going public. By going public, I'm referring essentially to the process through which incumbent politicians go about their communication strategies in a competitive media environment. Last time, if you recall, we were talking about political campaigns. So that is what happens when individuals are seeking office and trying to come up against this media environment and have essentially a communication style that allows them to reach potential voters. Campaigns, of course, as we saw, are these very powerful actors in that media environment, specifically because they're seeking to craft messaging strategies that will resonate with voters with the help of consultants. And of course, the consultant-driven campaign is now $1 billion industry every couple of years in the United States. And this very, very densely sort of well-funded industry is now one of the most important sorts of political actors coming up alongside, and in some cases even supplanting the former role of political parties and political media. Paid advertising, as we saw last time, is one of the most important ways in which these campaigns actually get their messages out to voters. However, we can also remember that free media is a really important goal of many political campaigns, as they're attempting as much as possible to get the media, that is journalists, interested in covering them, and then hopefully positively. So we saw that there is a tension here between the expensive but potentially easily controlled message that you might be able to get out through paid advertising. We can compare that to the free media approach, which essentially gives control over the message to journalists to have essentially total control. So it's a little bit more risky, as we saw, for campaigns to give this level of access to journalists. However, it is free, so it might be a good strategy for a campaign that is somewhat cash-strapped. But if we were to assume that these campaigns actually were successful and a candidate made it into office and got a chance to become a political incumbent, the messaging strategy and the kinds of thoughtfulness that goes into persuasive communication does not go away. And in fact, it becomes even more complicated. And that is because office holders have to balance competing goals, multiple goals perhaps. And of course, one of the most important, if not the most important goals of office holders is re-election. These office holders, if you think about the House of Representatives in the United States, every 2 years, these people are up for re-election. All across the country, all 435 members of the House of Representatives are up for re-election every 2 years. And as a result, unless you're retiring, you're going to be spending a tremendous amount of your time and energy thinking about that next election. As soon as you take office, you're pretty much back on the campaign trail. But in addition to that, very exhausting process of constantly seeking re-election, we have to think about policy goals as well. You don't go to Congress just to hang out. You actually probably have been elected to do something for your constituency, and you probably have been elected because you feel very strongly about certain issues. We know that these members of Congress, again, don't get into Congress for no reason. They usually are very motivated by some ideological goal. And so, this is kind of one of their most important, objectives in Congress is to actually get stuff done, believe it or not. And so obtaining policy goals, getting bills passed into law that agree with their ideological predispositions is a very important part of the strategy, and something that, of course, can be influenced through persuasive messaging. And then finally, if we think about Congress, we can remember that these members of Congress exist within a committee system and exist within a hierarchy. In Congress, if you're a first-time member of Congress, you're going to be trying to work your way up through this congressional committee system, trying to hold more and more important positions in Congress so that eventually you can have a bigger influence over politics today. So in order to accomplish these various goals, you're going to have to tailor your communication strategy to do all of these things. So, of course, if you're trying to get reelected, you want to appeal to voters in your districts, in your constituencies. To pursue policy goals, you're going to want to communicate, to other members of Congress about your seriousness of certain policy goals, of your commitments and your loyalties. And for advancement as well, you want to, make sure that you're saying things perhaps that accord with some of the party's interests as well, because those congressional committee systems are determined largely by the party leadership of each party. So you're going to have to be very careful about the way that you craft these communications if you are an incumbent. And of course, today we see that a lot of the time these incumbents are crafting communications that are designed to be spread to the public. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, for much of U.S. history before the current era, we saw that incumbents did not go public very often. And in fact, if you think about presidents, even presidents, as late as the 1950s and 60s, were very rarely, appearing before the public and making major announcements. FDR's fireside chats would be a notable exception, where he, for the first time, used radio to try to reach the public and talk to them about some of the exigencies of the war. It wasn't until the era of Truman that we would see a televised presidential State of the Union address, for example, which was a big, major event where the president would be able to communicate their specific goals and their essentially review of how the country has been doing. And so instead, you'd see that a lot of incumbents would be thinking about ways to engage in closed-door communications with one another. So presidents, for example, would have a lot of very intense meetings with members of Congress, attempting to persuade them that their presidential agenda was the thing to focus on. When they went public, presidents often sought to balance essentially these partisan objectives with national unity as being the primary goal. So if you're a president, you obviously don't want to cause divisiveness, you don't want to cause negativity, you want the entire public to be behind you, and you want to serve that figurehead role of somebody who's able to sort of rally the nation together to overcome certain obstacles. Today, however, we see that presidents will go public much more often to pursue partisan objectives than they did in the past. I mean, we can go back to Harry Truman, for example, and see, in the State of the Union addresses, it was all essentially about how America was doing and how we can all work together to make America, thrive and prosper in the next year. Whereas now, we'll see that these objectives are front and center in many presidential communications. So the public addresses have changed a bit over time, and certainly we can see some examples of that in the module this week. So in the modern era, what we call the media politics era, where media and politics are sort of inextricably fused, presidents and other incumbents are attempting in all times, at all modes, to champion issues to the public. And of course, we know that there are some new incentives to doing this. Presidents can think about this opinion leadership as a way to put pressure on Congress to get the job done. And of course, there are many more modes now, modalities, and media for the president to be able to reach the public in that direct way. And so direct appeals by presidents have become a much more attractive option. But despite the fact that we have a Twitter and we have direct kinds of appeals that can go out on shared on Facebook or that kind of thing, presidents are still pretty cagey about access. And certainly one of the biggest things that we want to talk about this week and that we'll talk about in our class discussion is the idea that access and the relationship between presidents and journalists is still one that is fraught with a lot of strategy and a lot of contention. And that is because if we were to, again, just like candidates, hand our message to journalists to do whatever they will with it, we might be subject to changes that would jeopardize the integrity of the overall message. That is the point of our communications, the objective that we're trying to achieve in influencing the public. So this is still, despite this new media politics era where direct appeals are much more possible, we can see that this exposure and this interaction with political journalists who are, many of them trying to do their jobs in a way that emphasizes their watchdog role. This is still a really important and difficult strategy for presidents and other incumbents. Now, thinking more specifically about the White House staff, thinking about presidents in particular, we can think about the fact that there are a lot of people that work on this staff with the express intent of trying to craft this message and make sure that it reaches the public unharmed by journalists. And so, we can think about first and foremost the press office, the White House press office, which is a really important, group of individuals who are constantly engaging in the issuance of written press releases and responses to inquiries by journalists. They might, say that something happens in the news. Say, for example, there was some kind of, incident on an airliner, God forbid, and the plane landed safely, but there was a mechanical issue with the plane, and the press essentially wants to ask the president, hey, what are you going to do about this? Are you going to tell the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, to investigate what happened here? Why did the plane break? Thank goodness that it landed safely, but can we get an investigation to find out if this kind of thing is likely to happen again? They would field these inquiries, and they would hopefully write up some kind of statement saying, the president is engaged in, ongoing communications with the FAA, and we'll get a statement to you shortly or something. That's the kind of relationship that the press office might have with inquiring journalists. But more specifically, you might run into an individual called the press secretary, who is this direct, visible figurehead link between the White House and the press, and who engages in most often press conferences with essentially the pool of White House reporters that are engaged in this direct, sometimes confrontational press conference format, where they actually come to the White House and they engage in this back and forth, sometimes on a daily basis with some presidents, with other presidents on a much more infrequent basis. And there's all kinds of other individuals you can look at here in this flow chart. You can think about people who are in charge of global communication. That is, the people who are interested in designing the entire message and thinking about all of the different pieces of it. The Department of Communications, which is all about the planning of media appearances. So if the president were to go on a talk show, for example, or were to go out in the public to do some kind of event, press events, and of course, that's going to have a lot to do with the communications director, who's in charge of overseeing this information and managing generally the image of the president. And of course, nowadays we have a very important staff here, the New Media Office, which is responsible for the president's social media presence. And they're going to be, constantly looking for mentions of the president on social media, constantly scanning their Twitter page and putting in new content and managing that content to make sure that the president's message is presented in the best light possible. Speechwriters also have a really important job in the modern presidency because, of course, there are many occasions during which presidents will want to give speeches, and those speechwriters are going to be, again, communicating very directly with many of these other individuals to create content for addresses that's going to resonate with the public, that's going to win over hearts and minds, but is also going to stay true to that fundamental message that the president is interested in propagating. So all these things together are super important roles in trying to craft that message. And again, part of the reason why these individuals are so necessary is because this message is like a ship, on stormy seas, right? It's trying to be floated out here across water with many hazards in its way. And so those hazards can include, for example, the White House Press Corps. So this press corps is a group of individuals who are arrayed in 49 seats essentially in the White House in a special briefing room. And they often are met by the press secretary for news briefings. This is a really important role, and it's one of the sort of highlights of a journalist's career, perhaps, to get to sit in one of those coveted seats and ask questions directly to the White House press secretary. The press secretary themselves, though, given the fact that this has, over the last century or so, become a hallmark feature of presidential communication, these press secretaries have a really important role to play, and many of them have thought about their jobs quite differently. So, we'll see some examples in just a moment. Each press secretary is seeking ultimately to, again, convey the president's message in a way that protects that message and in a way that casts the president in as positive a light as possible. However, you might think to yourself quite cynically, like, oh, well, this just means that the press secretary gets up there and lies to the press. That's not a very effective strategy, right? That's a strategy that ultimately harms trust. And so for many press secretaries, one of the biggest, goals that the press secretary has tried to engender is to just have the press understand that while they are trying to craft a narrative that paints the president in as positive a light as possible, nothing that they say can be refuted by the facts. And so that's, I think, a really important piece of this. Of course, that has varied to some extent over the past. We've seen some press secretaries who are very reserved and unwilling to share any details with members of the press, where those details are not confirmable or not immediately apparent. Others have played faster and looser, and sometimes to the extent that they've pissed off the president because they've said, "Hey, we weren't ready to share that. This is not information that's for the press yet." Others have, maybe also engaged in an even more adversarial relationship, where they've sought to distract the press or to refute the press's questions with pointed and targeted kinds of insults. So the current members of the press corps are numerous, as you might imagine. We've got a lot of different news outlets that have those coveted seats, right? To get one of these press passes, this is a very important step, and it's something that the White House actually goes about. They actually vet these individuals to make sure that they're credible, good journalists who are doing good work. You can see that some of the usual suspects are here, the major TV outlets, including NBC, ABC, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, right? Some of the big ones are there. The foreign pool, this is actually a very important piece of this puzzle. You've got Agence France Presse, for example, the big French news service, and some London newspapers as well. Al Jazeera is there because they're conveying information about the United States and about the president's policies back to their home countries as well for distribution abroad. Of course, newspapers, right? We talked in the last couple of classes about the importance of these legacy media organizations. And again, even though newspapers are doing very poorly financially right now, they still see an important role for sending paid reporters to the White House to follow along here. So, everyone from New York Times to McClatchy, which is a large newspaper conglomerate, to the New York Post, have individuals in the room to ask questions. And again, these are people who are paid a competitive salary to live in Washington and to attend these press conferences all the time. Radio, interestingly, there's a lot of radio sources where they have an individual journalist that is paid to attend these conferences, so including the Westwood One Media Network, Sirius XM, which is an interesting inclusion. We have satellite radio here. Fox Radio has their own individual, and many other radio sources, including, of course, National Public Radio. Online sources have become much more prevalent in the press corps, including Real Clear Politics, RCP, Yahoo News, and Huffington Post are some, but not all of these online sources. A couple magazines out there. I should also mention, of course, wire services are really important. So Reuters and the Associated Press are sort of the two biggest ones, in addition to Agence France Presse. These wire services distribute news to many other sources out there, as we read about in an earlier court case. And they are very, very instrumental. And so the AP and Reuters journalists are often sort of front row in these press briefings to listen and to ask questions to get clarification about ongoing developments. Finally, we should also mention that during the Trump presidency, there was a lot of controversy surrounding who got to be in some of these seats. And so sometimes you'll have individuals who can come into the briefing that are not regular seated members that can ask questions. Essentially, the Trump White House allowed in some far-right media that have come under heavy criticism from other media sources in the past for essentially being propaganda elements. So, for example, OAN, One American News, is essentially like a Fox News that's further right than Fox News. And so they had some members at various intervals during the Trump presidency and asked questions that were essentially softballs of the various, White House staff. And really, this was very controversial, essentially, and something that the legacy media, these earlier media sources, were sort of loath to support this. And so now, I think an interesting kind of current development is that the Biden presidency, obviously, the individuals responsible for dealing out these press passes have been unlikely to give these individuals press passes, and it's resulted in some tension because they've said, hey, we were in the room before, what's going on now? Is this a violation of freedom of speech? That's an important question, but one that I think, again, speaks to the power of our institutions in controlling who's in the room. The press secretaries, certainly we've seen over the Trump administration, we had a lot of turnover. We began with Sean Spicer over here. We ended with Kayleigh McEnany after 4 years. And so this was a sort of a large degree of turnover in the press secretary role. We can see that across these various press secretaries, we had sort of the biggest and most shocking sort of development from the perspective of scholars was this extremely adversarial relationship with the press corps. Never before did you have essentially the press secretaries get into it, right? Be as sort of nasty, as divisive, as deal as much pushback to these individuals as we had before. And essentially this was a strategic kind of communication style that the Trump presidency had developed, castigating the media and making them as adversarial as possible in order to sort of pit the media against them as a strategic tool. And so again, this is a huge departure from other administrations because we often in the past had seen administrations obviously not giving an inch against media who were trying to get answers to the tough questions, but certainly not engaging in ad hominem attacks or other kinds of intense kinds of rebuttals. So again, this is a new development. I think again one that as we read the reading for this week, we can think about how this might fit into the overall communication style and the strategy of a White House in these various regimes. So of course, Jen Psaki is the current press secretary of the Joe Biden administration. Jen Psaki is a former CNN correspondent who is, I think, the biggest difference, in addition to the change in sort of style from being more adversarial to being slightly less adversarial, but still, again, quite strong in defending the interests of the White House. Jen Psaki is giving press briefings on a much more regular basis. So, for example, the Trump presidency actually didn't hold a press conference for over 100. It was like 168 days or something at some point during the Trump administration. So, a full eighth of the entire presidency was actually there was no press conference, and so that was also a huge departure where Trump obviously was much more likely to use direct appeals through social media than these kinds of surrogate communications. So now we're back to a more I wouldn't say normal, but a more a traditional kind of communication style, where there is again this closer relationship with the press, and this is now, I think the Biden administration sees this as an easier and more straightforward vehicle for trying to control the message. So when we think about all of this, the press pool and the White House, the press corps and the press secretary and all of these strategic elements, we want to think about the broader theory. And that is to ask those questions of sort of, why is this occurring? How is it that we can model this? Are there certain regularities that we might come to expect? And I want to draw your attention especially to the Skacko and Co. reading. I think that's a good one to look at when thinking about this theory, because they make this case that the presidency is in fact shifting. It's evolving from what they call the rhetorical presidency to what they now call the ubiquitous presidency. I think the ubiquitous presidency is an important kind of theory to use right now to think about how presidents do their jobs, how they deploy this message strategy. And I want to think about in this reading, as you go through and compare the rhetorical presidency to the ubiquitous presidency, I want to think about the recent cases that we have and whether they fit into these definitions. What is a rhetorical presidency anyway? Obviously, we have in the reading many examples of it from previous years. What I want to know is Biden a rhetorical president or a ubiquitous president or maybe something else? And also Trump, right? Is Trump a ubiquitous president? Is Trump an example of this ubiquitous presidency? Or do you think his communication style actually defied this definition as well? So think carefully about these theoretical definitions and try to fit those cases that we have, the recent cases, into the theories to better understand how they work. And maybe you have some complaints about the theories. And you don't think those theories accurately describe reality anymore. If that's the case, then that's actually a really great sign you have a good understanding of this content. Moving on to Block into Green. This week you're going to be reading this, I think, very interesting, thought-provoking article which details another theory of presidential communication. They talk about a populist communication style. And so, of course, if we go back just a second to the Skacko and Co. article, I think it's a really good reflex to think about sort of comparing, just like we did earlier in the models of the press unit, compare the rhetorical and the ubiquitous styles to the populist style. How are these things different? What are the different assumptions being made? And of course, let's do the same thing that we did in that previous piece as well when we compare the modern presidencies that we've observed in recent years to this theory. Do we think that the two presidents that we've had over the last couple of years in this turnover, do you think that either of them fit the definition of this populist communication style? Do they not fit that definition? And if not, what the heck is going on? Do you think that maybe you need to devise another communication style that would more accurately describe the modern presidents of the United States? And then finally, I think this is a great piece and one that you should read. Enjoy reading. It's well written as well. This is Martha Joynt Kumar, who's a professor who actually worked at Towson for a very long time. And one of Professor Kumar's biggest sort of research contributions was a really in-depth sort of ethnographic study of the White House press corps and this specific relationship we've been talking about, the relationship between the press corps and the press secretary. And I want you to think about, as you read this, what it's like to be somebody who works in this press corps and how, again, this adversarial relationship plays out. Of course, the other thing is that the Kumar piece is now several years old, right? It's actually quite old at this point. And so I wonder, can we update some of what Professor Kumar is writing in this piece to the modern era? And are there differences that we're observing now? Are there similarities to the current administrations? And essentially, what's going on in the modern era? I'm especially interested in how the press corps members that Professor Kumar describes, how they might compare to that list that we just looked at just a moment ago. Are there new entrants to this list? Are there some who have exited that stage, and why might that be? So I think it's a really interesting piece, and I hope that you enjoy reading it because, again, I find it to be kind of a breath of fresh air when we're reading some of these really heavy theoretical pieces. This one is a lot more descriptive, and I certainly enjoy that. So I hope you do too. Last but not least, this week I want to mention your multimedia project. I want to encourage you to keep working. Don't leave this till the last minute. That's a really bad idea because, of course, there's a lot of moving pieces here. I think now certainly is beyond time for you to be obtaining the audio and the text for your projects. Please don't leave this to the last minute, as I've just said. And if you run into questions, if you run into any concerns or things are breaking or not working the way that you like, please just feel free to email me with any and all questions. And of course, as I let you go today, the most important thing to remember at all times during this course, and pretty much for the rest of your life as well, is to try to have fun. I'll see you next time.